Hello and welcome to the History of Bangalore. I am Ramjee Chandran and this is episode 80 of season 2. In the last episode, we looked at the death of Kempe Gowda and went over the circumstances of his death, the theories, the opinions, the disagreements surrounding the date of his death. But that said, the pete that he built was overwhelmingly successful. In very little time, his creation, Bengaluru, had started to become a cosmopolitan town. Tales of its urban pitch reaching everywhere in India and everywhere else that international traders happened to visit. Such things invite attention and unfortunately paint a target on the city's back. In short, such a city becomes a desirable acquisition target. In this episode, we will see that the first battle of Bengaluru was not long in coming. The pete was built just after 1537 and the first attack it had to defend happened quickly in 1612. But before I get into how and what happened, I must take a moment to thank my sponsors, the Prestige Group. It is with their support that I can bring you this podcast. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. After the passing of Kempe Gowda I, Immadi Kempe Gowda or Kempe Gowda II had taken over as the Nada Prabhu of Yelahanka. Some say that there was a Gidde Gowda before Kempe Gowda II, but history seems to have treated him as forgettable, so that's what we will do here. Let's begin by painting a picture. Imagine a city that has done everything right. It has grown steadily, wisely, and well. Its markets are busy, its water tanks are full, the walls of its fort are strong, the people are well fed. Importantly, the ruler is respected. For a city in the early 17th century South India, a time of collapsing empires, shifting loyalties, and constant low-level conflict, this was no small achievement. This is Bengaluru. And this is the moment roughly around the turn of the 17th century when everything that he had built would be tested. To understand what comes next, you need to understand what sort of place Bengaluru had become by then. By the late 16th century, the city had become a node. Now let's remind ourselves what that means. Urbanization in the Deccan interiors was driven by trade routes. Now this area was the hub of many trade routes, west coast to east coast and back, and then the Dakshinapatha routes that came in from the north and peeled off, heading to and from either coast. The places where traders halted for the night to get food and rest started to attract settlers who provided service to these traders, and eventually these became towns. In Bengaluru's case, a big, hopping, happening city. And what this meant, practically speaking, was more people and more money. Steady, predictable, increasingly substantial money. Inevitably, the state steps in, and taxes collected from the trade and settled household rose consistently through the late 16th century in Bengaluru. And by the early decades of the 17th century, the contemporary records that we hear place Bengaluru's annual yield at approximately 50,000 barahas. One baraha is about 3.4 grams of gold. So the state revenue from the Hublis, or the collection of villages under Kempe Gowda's management, was about 1.7 tons of gold a year. By today's February 2026 prices, which is a shade under 16,000 rupees a gram, that would be well over 250 crores. That would buy a lot today. It bought even more 500 years ago. But importantly, we need to understand that that load of money was not something like a windfall. It was not the product of one lucky year or a conquest or a single exceptional harvest. It was the result of a functioning system, reliable markets, settled households and mechanisms for collecting revenue that had been refined over decades. So what did that money buy? It bought the city itself. Bengaluru was able to invest in its own infrastructure in ways that compounded its value. Water management was a sustained priority. Existing tanks, those large reservoirs that were the lifeblood of any city in this part of India, were deepened and repaired, New and connected reservoirs were constructed at the city's expanding edges to serve a growing population and all the cattle, and also to serve the growing population and cattle of the trade routes. Now, the maintenance of water channels was important. They connected them up smartly, so water remained available where it was needed the most, where density was the highest and pressure on daily life was the greatest. And this also reduced the seasonal stress. By connecting up the tanks with channels, it reduced the internal disruption that drought and scarcity could produce in one part. At the same time, defensive infrastructure was also expanded. The Bengaluru fort was a mud fort. Now, I explained this in detail in a previous episode. Listen to it in episode 71. It's titled The Fort and the Defense of Bengaluru. While a mud fort was useful and strong, it was not as strong as a stone fort. And because the Vijayanagara kings did not allow all the palegars to build stone forts, the mud fort itself needed something of a defense. So Immadi Kempe Gowda, it is said, built watchtowers at 4 cardinal points in the city with sentries who could watch for approaching trouble. Now, these 4 watchtowers are visible even today. Population followed function as it always does, and before long, Bengaluru was bustling. By the turn of the 17th century, Bengaluru appeared complete. In a very real sense, it was. But here's the thing about prosperity. In a certain way, it is also a provocation. A city that generated 50,000 barahas a year with deep water tanks, stock granaries, a great fort, and sitting astride all the key routes of the South Indian plateau, a city like that is not invisible. In fact, it's enormously visible. And visibility in the politics of the 17th century South India was not always a comfortable thing. The success of the Bengaluru Pete created a very particular tension. Bengaluru's revenues made Bengaluru's rulers regionally dominant. That means, in the royal measure, the revenues of all the neighboring palegars territories were now secondary. In the world of the palegars, secondary means subordinate. And subordinate was not a status that any ambitious chief quietly accepted, and certainly not to Kempe Gowda. During the time of Kempe Gowda I, one man in particular had not accepted it at all. His name was Jagadevaraya, the Palegar of Channapatna. And if you've been following this series, his name might ring a bell, and not one with a very pleasant sound. Jagadevaraya, it is said, had been responsible for the imprisonment of Kempe Gowda. And once imprisoned, Ali Ramaraya at the time had given custody of the Yelahanka Nadu, Bengaluru, all the territories, to Jagadevaraya to keep in check. Now that episode had not been forgotten. Years later, with Immadi Kempe Gowda ruling Bengaluru, and with Bengaluru's revenues overshadowing everything around it, the old tensions came roaring back. When a neighboring Palegar looked at Bengaluru, he did not see a successful city, one that he could be proud of. He saw a city that made him look small. A city that in practice, if not in formal rank, was asserting authority over him. Such a thing was intolerable. By the time of Immadi, in the early 1600s, the fall of the city of Vijayanagara was far behind, almost half a century before. Now the ruling Aravidu dynasty, who were Vijayanagara's 4th dynasty, was already on the throne, and the third in line of that dynasty, 4th if you count Ali Ramaraya, was Venkata II. He followed Tirumala and Sriranga I. Now these were the kings running a fractured Vijayanagara, and they lived by the loyalty of Palegars like the Kempe Gowda family. But not all the Palegars were loyal. Among them were those who began signaling their intention to break away from the Vijayanagara imperial system. They included Timma III of Chikkaballapur and Doddaballapur, Bhairava of Devanahalli, Rangappa of Sira, and the successors of Jagadevaraya in Channapatna, the old enemy of Kempe Gowda, and Chikkadevarayalu of Hoskote. These were the men who, by a coalition, laid siege to Bengaluru in 1612. And it's now time for a commercial break, and when I come back, let's get into the detail of what happened, the confederacy, the siege that would define how Bengaluru faced every conflict that came after. Right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. RERA approved.
Hi, I'm back. Before the break, we talked about what Bengaluru had become and about the resentment that prosperity generated among all the palegars. Now we come to the moment that resentment became war. I call this the first battle of Bengaluru because it was the very first military engagement in the history of the city as we know it today. One account of this battle comes to us through a literary source. It's a work called the Kempe Gowda II, and it is available to look at the Oriental Research Institute in Mysore. It is by nature something of a celebratory text, like a paean to the king. Let's bear in mind that in such texts, facts often take a second seat to a good story. There's little we can do about this, other than acknowledge that there will be some gaps in the verifiable timelines and in the facts and get on with the rest of it. So with all that in mind, this is what the political situation was in the day. Let's look at the lead up to the battle. As I started to say, there were 2 different accounts about how the Battle of Bengaluru came about. One from Fazlul Hasan, who relied a lot on the Kempe Gowda II, and the other from T.V. Annaswamy, both authors of books on Bengaluru. Considering that neither of them had any real verifiable source of information, it is surprising that they managed to find 2 different ways to describe the causes of the Battle of Bengaluru. But I have the benefit of bringing you both those versions today. In Fazlul Hasan's version of the Kempe Gowda II, Immadi Kempe Gowda had a problem with Chikkaraya. What problem is not very clear. He simply called it the perfidy of the Hoskote Palegar without taking the trouble to explain what perfidy. Anyway, to settle this perfidious Palegar, Immadi marched on Hoskote and plundered it. This, according to Fazlul Hasan, angered someone called Venkata. Hasan confusingly describes this individual as Venkata of Penukonda, without being clear that this was Vijayanagara King Venkata II, leaving it to our own inference. Venkata II was angry because he saw Immadi Kempe Gowda strike against Chikkaraya of Hoskote as an act of insubordination that disrupted the order of an already declining Vijayanagara empire. This was also probably a chance for the king to support the palegars who were on the verge of breaking away by uniting them against Kempe Gowda and supporting their coalition of jealousy so that he could keep them loyal. So, what Immadi Kempe Gowda had succeeded in doing by plundering Hoskote was not to end the problem, but to escalate it. The assault provoked exactly the kind of response that a coordinated military strike requires. It gave the breakaway palegars a common cause. So Venkata II called for collective action. The Confederate palegars, together with the Imperial Army, formed a combined force, and they marched on Bengaluru and placed the city under siege. This was the first siege of Bengaluru we know. It was the first time in the city's history that an organized military force surrounded its walls, cut off its approaches, and attempted to take it by force. The confederacy was numerically stronger than Immadi's forces, significantly so if you consider that it included units from the Imperial Army. Some accounts say that the Confederate forces also attempted to strike additional strategic points within the Yelahanka Nadu, including Ramagiri, which is near present-day Ramanagara, and also Shivaganga. Bengaluru was under pressure from all directions. And yet, Immadi Kempe Gowda did not simply defend the Pete and wait. Despite being outnumbered, or maybe because of it, and despite the city being under siege, Immadi organized a break. He pushed through the besieging lines, forced an opening through the Confederate ranks, and fighting followed at close quarters. This was hand-to-hand, brutal, close-in fighting, and Immadi Kempe Gowda succeeded. He routed the combined armies, and got the siege lifted. Now he could have stopped there. He had relieved the city, he had broken the siege, he had won a significant defensive victory against a numerically superior force, and that alone should have been enough. But no, he gathered his armed retainers and levies across all his territories and moved into Hoskote, and then deliberately razed, destroyed, dismantled the fort. What followed this military victory was that Venkata II changed his mind about Immadi Kempe Gowda, who, right through all of these things, still stayed loyal to the throne. And then it is said that Immadi Kempe Gowda made the errant palegars accompany him to Penukonda, where they attended the formal coronation of Venkata and made them all pay tribute to the king. In recognition, the emperor formally acknowledged Immadi Kempe Gowda and conferred upon him the title Guardian of the Empire. As hard as I tried, I could not find a way to account for the many gaps in this story, so as I said, that is something we will live with. Now, I want to offer you a somewhat different version of the same events from the historian Annaswamy. In his telling, the trouble begins with a death. Around 1612, a Palegar named Timmaya Gowda of Sugattur in the Kolar district had died. Following his death, another Palegar, Ayyamma Gowda of Avati, seized control of Sugattur and all its treasury. This was an opportunistic land grab in the wake of a successful vacuum. But Sugattur was on the eastern boundary of Kempe Gowda's territory, and Kempe Gowda responded. He attacked Avati, he ravaged the countryside around Kolar, he advanced towards Hoskote and placed it under siege. Facing this pressure, Ayyamma Gowda appealed to Venkata II, the emperor, for military assistance, and Venkataraya marched. He established a camp near Ballapura and coordinated with the neighboring Palegars and aligned them all against Kempe Gowda. The combined forces compelled Kempe Gowda to raise the siege of Hoskote and withdraw to Bengaluru. So in this version, Kempe Gowda was pushed back first, and the emperor's intervention had worked, at least initially. But not for long. A battle followed. Ayyamma Gowda was killed in the fighting, and despite the presence of both the imperial army and the allied Palegars, Immadi Kempe Gowda had won. He routed the combined forces and drove them away from Bengaluru. And then he captured Hoskote and installed his own garrison there. Immediately following that, Venkata II attempted a second assault on Bengaluru, and that too failed. And what happened next is genuinely fascinating. After having established his dominance over the rival Palegars, Immadi Kempe Gowda did not declare independence from the Vijayanagara dynasty. He doubled down on his loyalty to them. He declared his support to Venkatadevaraya, the very man whose forces he had just defeated, twice, depending on whose version you believe, and then he appealed to him to restore peace and order in the region. Venkata II, always looking for a way to sustain his legitimacy, advanced into the Kolar district and set up a camp near Betamangala. This is near Kolar goldfields. And there, Immadi Kempe Gowda met him, accompanied by the Palegars of Hoskote, Devanahalli, Chikkaballapura, and all the other neighboring territories. They all presented themselves before Venkata, and in recognition of Immadi Kempe Gowda's role in supporting his cause and restoring order, Venkatadevaraya formally acknowledged him as guardian of the empire. Different story, same outcome. The common element here was the first battle of Bengaluru. Now it must be said that there is a reference to a battle of Bengaluru on the famous Begur inscription stone dated 890 AD. But no one knows where that Bengaluru was, but it was not this one. So maybe we should call that 9th century inscription the ground zero of the battles of Bengaluru. The Battle of Bengaluru was a hinge moment. It demonstrated that Immadi Kempe Gowda could fight, and fight well, against numerically superior forces. It also demonstrated that the prosperity that Bengaluru had accumulated was not merely a source of pride, it became a target. And it demonstrated something darker, something that would matter greatly in the years to come. The very fact that such a confederacy could form at all that neighboring palegars had been able to coalesce around the shared resentment of Bengaluru's success pointed to a change in the political landscape that no military victory could fully reverse. Authority could still be enforced, but enforcing it now required the kind of action that risked escalation. So, what followed would be different, bigger, more consequential, more dangerous to Bengaluru. The forces now beginning to move towards Bengaluru were no longer confined to local rivalry or negotiated alliance or just some errant palegars. Bengaluru had proved that it could grow. It now had to prove that it could endure. Maybe Bengaluru had always been getting too famous for its own good. In the next episode, we turn to the coming end of local rule and to the larger forces that came in from the North Territories and from history itself that were beginning to converge on the city on the plateau. It only gets more exciting by the day and, of course, by the episodes. See you soon. I am Ramjee Chandran and this is the history of Bangalore.